You think I'm probing the camera a bit too much? I think this is enough promotion as it is. Well, thank you for joining me on the channel, and welcome to the first episode of March Madness. Or rather, Marvel March Madness. I'm not a huge basketball guy, but, I had to do something. Had to do something for March, right? Instead of doing the bland old reviews that I usually do, I figured it'd be kind of fun to pit all 18 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe films that have been released to date, that is, to actually be going up head to head to head to head to head to head in order to become what is considered my favorite Marvel movie to go up against Avengers Infinity War in May. Oh, and by the way, if you are a fan of this shirt, this is not a paid promotion at all. I'm just figuring if you are a huge Marvel fan, I'm going to link in the description below an Amazon listing for this specific t-shirt. Now, what's also really cool about this t-shirt is on the back, you have all your favorite Marvel movies in order of release. So, I'll leave that in the description below, and let's get into the intro for the show. Ten years ago, Iron Man was released and became one of the highest grossing films of 2008, along with The Dark Knight and various other films. And since then, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has grown to about $14 billion at the global box office, has spawned 18 movies, not including the ones that have yet to be released, 10 TV shows, and tons of merchandising. And while I, as a film critic, would love to go through and revisit all these films as just pure review, I would rather not waste my time in doing so. Because by now, most people would rather just watch the movies as opposed to, hear other people's opinions on these films. However, I am not going to be excluded from the festivities. Since this is the 10th anniversary of Marvel, I figure let's play a little game. Let's play a game I like to call Marvel March Madness. Now, this is because I don't have the rights to Marvel Contest of Champions because, well, that's already trademarked and can't really do anything else. So let's just rip off the NBA, because it is March after all, and just create a whole tournament bracket. All 18 films are going to go head to head to head to head. The films, in order to grant points and to get them ahead in the game, are going to follow a certain method called the SAC method. The method entails story, action, character, and comedy. And yes, I know the name sounds very suggestive, SAC, But in order to gain points, each combatant needs to have 1 point in favor of them in each of the categories. And these are the 4 categories I most commonly find for most people's entertainment inside of each Marvel film. Each Marvel film does entail a good amount of story, good amount of character, good amount of action, and a good amount of comedy. And how do they stack up against each other in a one-on-one match? And essentially, trying to answer the question, if I had a rainy day and had these 2 films in front of me, which one would I pick according to the SAC method? So, we're going to go through maybe 5 rounds. 5 rounds? Yeah. Let's go through 5 matches today, and the rest of the 5 will be Oscar Sunday, and let's do it. So, the first matchup is the Incredible Hulk and Doctor Strange. When it comes to the story, both have issues. The Incredible Hulk is incredibly boring and has almost little to nothing to do with the MCU other than the inclusion of General Ross. It is almost formulaic in its execution. On the other hand, Doctor Strange is a bit different. Not only does it have key items related to the broader MCU with the Time Stone, but it isn't exactly boring. It has a genuinely enjoyable story filled with world building. However, the world building is kinda minimal. There were people who wanted more out of the exploring of the weird world of magic in the MCU. Nevertheless, Doctor Strange wins the story category by a slight margin. Action is a very easy thing to screw up, but Marvel usually has ways of making the action fun and interesting. The Incredible Hulk kind of lacks in this department. While it is cool to see the Hulk grab pieces of automobiles and use them as gloves against Abomination, it just doesn't seem too creative. It is just two giant people fighting in the streets. Doctor Strange, on the other hand, is much more engaging. The use of magic helps make sequences memorable. The Mirror Realm sequences, for example, which take place in an Inception concept, made chase sequences and fight sequences visually engaging and interesting. And let's not forget about the bargaining sequences at the end of the film with Dormammu. And in a fight of creativity, Doctor Strange wins the bout. Marvel usually has a good track record when it comes to making their heroes memorable. The Incredible Hulk, once again, fails that concept. Edward Norton, while being a terrific actor outside of the MCU, couldn't make Bruce Banner's inner conflict interesting or engaging. Doctor Strange also has a character problem as well. Strange comes off as another Tony Stark, but way too snarky and doesn't fully change by the end. But he does change in the film, don't get me wrong, but his character can come off as annoying. In a battle of characters, however, I could take Doctor Strange and his antics over an uncharismatic Banner. I like both characters, but Doctor Strange wins it yet again. And comedy is the last ingredient, and I automatically award this one to Doctor Strange. The Incredible Hulk, as mentioned before, is a boring slog of a film. Point once again goes to Doctor Strange and moves on to fight on with Iron Man. Iron Man's story isn't necessarily fresh, but it is still entertaining. A story about a person building himself back together after being blown apart and growing beyond his selfish ways it kind of plays off like a modernized version of A Christmas Carol. I would say Iron Man wins this because Iron Man first started this whole origin story bit that Doctor Strange just blatantly appropriated. Iron Man's action is some of the best of the MCU. Flying around with Iron Man while he blasts away in his suit of iron is just plain old fun. The action in Doctor Strange is also similar, but the key here is creativity of the action. Doctor Strange wins this one because of its creativity in the fight sequences. Iron Man just isn't kinda there. Tony Stark is one of my favorite characters. He probably has one of my favorite arcs in his whole trilogy, and to the larger extent, the whole of the MCU. He is a bit snarky, yes, but also funny. That's the main difference between Iron Man and Tony Stark. The writing of the characters is enjoyable on both ends, and you don't think for a moment that the character is fake. By the end of the story, you really root for Tony Stark. Doctor Strange, on the other hand, has a disadvantage because his character is nearly identical to Tony Stark, but isn't as enjoyable as Tony Stark. I personally like both characters, but Iron Man wins. Iron Man wins this one. Iron Man has the advantage over Doctor Strange in terms of comedy. Where Doctor Strange is funny, some of it does feel forced. Some of the comedy could have been reduced a tiny bit, and those pop culture references to Beyonce is a bit much. Iron Man's comedy allows the story to move away from the cliches of superhero films, whereas Doctor Strange just kinda solidifies it. Point once again goes to Iron Man and moves up to the final 8. Both films have very different meanings. We have a group of outlaws versus a group of Earth's mightiest heroes. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 continues the story of the Guardians and advances their arcs in interesting ways. The themes of fatherhood, ego, and character connections are strong here and really reflects the independent film nature of James Gunn's own auteurship. However, the story is a bit unbalanced because of, well, the comedy getting in the way sometimes. The Avengers' story is perfectly alright. It is a fun team-up story with a lot of iconic scenes and sequences. The story is well balanced and an easy watch for anyone to enjoy. Both films have good stories, but we have to have a tiebreaker. Which film is the most rewatchable? That point would have to go to Guardians 2. After multiple views of the Avengers, the story is pretty basic, and there isn't much anything new to find. Unless Infinity War had something to say about it, but we'll get to that later. Guardians 2 is better in that regard. Point goes to Guardians 2. The action in both films are fun and energetic, so for the tiebreaker, we have to turn to the creativity angle. Guardians 2 wins this point. This is due to the couple of factors. The jailbreak sequence with Yondu and Rocket is creative, and its camera movement paired with the musical accompaniment is absolutely enjoyable. The final battle as well had some fun things, as well as with Peter and Ego morphing their bodies into different forms to fight. Just kind of funny. The Avengers' action is fun, but it isn't too creative. Most of the final fight is spent on trying to shut down a portal and disposing of a nuclear bomb. Point once again goes to Guardians 2. When it comes to characters, both films have their strengths. Guardians 2 develop their characters even further, and all are challenged by their own ego between each other. The themes develop the characters as well as physically challenge them. However, in the Avengers, the characters here don't have too much development in the larger MCU. They just all come together and fight each other. The character drama is decent in the film, but the development of the characters is minimal. Yes, they are challenged, but only physically. Ideologically, it is very basic. Guardians 2 does both conflicts very well and very efficiently. Point once again goes to Guardians 2. The comedy in both films are great as well. I enjoy watching them both, but if it were me, the Avengers wins. The reason being that Guardians 2's comedy can, at times, slow down the pace of the film. Not saying that the comedy in Guardians 2 is bad, it is damn funny, but it is a bit too much at times. The Avengers' comedy works well because the comedy never overtakes the story. In fact, it's just part of the experience. And with only 1 point going to the Avengers, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 makes it to the final 8. Thor's story is a bit of a cliche. It is about a person who is arrogant, who is stripped of his power, and is taught to be humble by the end. Not to say that this story isn't good for what it does, it is just kind of okay in my opinion. The story is a bit mixed, where the stuff in Asgard is not too interesting because it isn't focused on too much. The stuff that is interesting are the dynamics between Loki and Thor, and the fish out of water stuff. However, the story behind Iron Man 3 I find more engaging. I know a lot of people will disagree with me on this, but I think Iron Man 3 was pretty good, including the fake Mandarin. The story in Iron Man 3 had some good twists and had a really good message about being a hero. How it isn't necessarily the suit that makes the hero, rather the person whom wears it. Point goes to Iron Man 3. The action between the two films couldn't be more different. Thor has some really boring action, and while it is cool to see Thor's hammer fly around, nothing here is too creative. Nothing visually or spectacularly, anyway. Iron Man 3 has some great action, decently handled. The sequence where Stark goes to the mansion with a ton of Home Alone inspired weapons and the final fight are awesome and visually creative. Point once again goes to Iron Man 3. Thor has some really fun side characters from Asgard, but Thor as a lead is incredibly weak toast. He is kind of bland. He can be funny, but in this film, he's just kind of boring. Iron Man 3 has some great characters as well, but I have to admit, the little kid Tony comes across is a bit annoying. The twist with the Mandarin is hilarious, and I didn't really see it coming, but his replacement, it's just kind of bland. It's just another person in a suit, just like the rest of the trilogy. Tony is challenged in multiple ways in this film, both in his relationship to Pepper Potts and also with his battle with PTSD from his event in New York. Iron Man 3, yet again, gets another point. Thor's comedy mostly comes from Thor's misunderstanding of Earth and its cultures, which can lead to it being stale at points. Iron Man 3's comedy is once again kinda decent, just like the first film in his trilogy, always subversive to what I would expect. The point, as well as moving on to the final 8, is Iron Man 3. Thor's world expands in a sequel, going to different worlds and exploring new concepts in terms of the Infinity Stones, but unfortunately, because there isn't any character in the editing or the story that makes it worthwhile to watch, it can seem very lackluster. Spider-Man Homecoming's story, however, is kind of fun to watch, and is engaging at points. To show the dynamics between Tony Stark and Peter Parker as mentor and student fits in a ton of ways. The story is funny and shows that some heroes need to grow into their own thing as opposed to trying to be their own heroes. The villain twist as well was unexpected and was also well executed. No contest, Spidey wins the bout. The action in Thor: The Dark World is lame in the worst kind of way. There is some creativity towards the end with Thor being teleported around, but the majority of the time, it is just Thor hammering people. Spider-Man Homecoming is a bit different. While it would be boring to just show Spidey thwipping webs, but to add in the AI interface into his suit allows for many different ways to spin a web. No pun intended. There are more standout scenes in Spider-Man Homecoming as opposed to Thor as well. Spider-Man Homecoming has the Washington Monument, the ferry, and even the airplane heist. Point, once again, is in Spidey's court. Thor doesn't get too much development in the sequel. Aside from him having to constantly worry about Natalie Portman, the only real developing conflict is that between Loki and Thor. What is a good constant in the Thor series, and to a larger extent the MCU, is the tenuous rivalry between the two brothers. In that respect, the scenes between those characters are fun and interesting, however, they are few and far between. Spider-Man Homecoming is also different. Peter as a character has some development, and this isn't exactly a origin story. The way his character is developed it is engaging as conflicts are relatable. The support characters are decently handled and are placed there very well. But the nail that puts Thor's characters in the coffin comes down to the villain. As mentioned before, the Vulture was well developed and well-meaning. I honestly couldn't remember anything about Malekith, other than he wants to rule the galaxy or destroy the universe. Bland, whatever. Again, Spidey wins this in the landslide. Thor: The Dark World is just kind of bad. What made the first Thor film work is the situational comedy that came with Thor being cast into Earth. The sequel doesn't have almost any comedy. There is maybe one scene where Loki transforms into Captain America for a brief bit,
but the comedy in this movie is just weak. Spider-Man Homecoming, however, is the complete opposite. This film has the classic tropes of a John Hughes film, which references Ferris Bueller a lot. Which is funny because Deadpool had references to Ferris Bueller, and Deadpool and Spidey have encountered each other in the comics, so you know it's funny, and we know it's going to happen. The comedy in the film is too much to discuss fully in this episode.
The point and the win goes to Spider-Man Homecoming, and we'll be moving on to the final 8. And that concludes the first round of matches. Come back in a couple days, and I will have the other half of the bracket going head to head to head to head to head, and we'll be continuing with 5 more matches. That should be very simple enough.